Harry Truman never expected to become President of the United States, not in 1945, not in the middle of the largest global conflict in human history, and definitely not with so little information in his hands. When he took the oath of office on April the 12th, he stepped into a role he had been completely unprepared for, and the moment he sat down behind Roosevelt's old desk, he fully understood the truth that had been building for months. Franklin Roosevelt, the man he had served under, never trusted him with the most important secrets of the war. To understand why this happened, you have to go back to the summer of 1944. Roosevelt was running for an unprecedented fourth term, but his health was failing rapidly. The Democratic Party leadership knew that whoever became the vice president would almost certainly become president. But Roosevelt's preferred choice, Henry Wallace, was considered too unpredictable by the party's inner circle. They wanted someone safe, someone steady, someone they could rely on to hold the line without shaking the political establishment. That man became Harry S. Truman. Truman wasn't chosen because Roosevelt wanted him. He was chosen because party bosses viewed him as a compromise candidate, a loyal Democrat, a reliable vote in the Senate, a man who could be controlled if needed. Roosevelt barely interacted with him during the campaign. In fact, the two men met only twice between the Democratic Convention and the inauguration. That alone shows how distant the relationship was. From the beginning, Roosevelt kept Truman on the outside. During the first weeks of 1945, Truman tried multiple times to involve himself in foreign policy decisions. He wanted to learn how the administration worked. He wanted to understand Roosevelt's war strategy, but every attempt was politely pushed aside. He was told that the president was handling matters personally. He was told that senior advisors were already managing everything. He was told that the issues were too complex, too sensitive, too delicate. In truth, Roosevelt was following a pattern he had used for years. He trusted only a very small circle of advisors, people like Harry Hopkins, Admiral Leahy, and a handful of military and diplomatic insiders. These were the people he relied on for everything. Roosevelt had always kept power tightly concentrated. It wasn't personal against Truman, it was Roosevelt's method of leadership. But for Truman, who desperately wanted to be useful, it felt like a door being shut in his face again and again. During this time, Truman still didn't know about the Manhattan Project. He had never been informed that the United States was developing a weapon unlike anything the world had ever seen. He also didn't know about the secret agreements Roosevelt had made with Churchill and Stalin during their conferences. He had no idea about the delicate debates over post-war Europe. He didn't know the details of the Allied strategy in the Pacific or the true timetable of the European front. He knew the big picture because everyone knew the big picture, but he didn't know the machinery behind it. He didn't know the decisions, the arguments, the diplomatic bargaining, or the silent promises made between leaders. In fact, one of the most shocking details of this period is that Truman was not even briefed on Roosevelt's deteriorating health. He didn't know how close the president was to collapsing. Roosevelt kept that information sealed from nearly everyone. His aides protected the secret because they feared that any sign of weakness would harm morale at home and confidence abroad. So Truman moved through these weeks unaware that he was on the brink of inheriting the entire war effort. On April the 12th, 1945, that moment arrived. Roosevelt was at Warm Springs, Georgia, working quietly and trying to regain some strength. Truman was on Capitol Hill when he received an urgent message telling him to come to the White House immediately. When he arrived, Eleanor Roosevelt stepped forward and delivered the news that would change his life. Truman was stunned. His first instinct was to ask how he could help. Eleanor answered with a sentence that echoed through history. "Harry, the burden is on you now." Within hours, Truman took the oath of office. A handful of senior officials filled the room, watching the once quiet senator from Missouri become commander-in-chief military leaders, and Roosevelt's advisors stood around him, all realizing what Truman did not. This man was stepping into the presidency almost completely blind. The first hours of Truman's presidency were a crash course in global strategy. As soon as the ceremony was over, Secretary of War Henry Stimson pulled Truman aside and told him that he needed to schedule a meeting as soon as possible to discuss something called a project of unusual destructive force. Truman didn't understand. Stimson was referring, in the most cautious way possible, to the atomic program. But Truman had never heard of it, not a whisper, not a hint. He was being told about it now because the responsibility had suddenly shifted to him. This was the moment Truman realized just how much Roosevelt had kept hidden. And it wasn't just the weapon, it was everything. Military planners had to brief him on operations in Europe, where Allied forces were closing in on Germany from both east and west. He had to be told about the discussions that Roosevelt had at Yalta with Churchill and Stalin, including the agreements on the future of Eastern Europe and the commitments regarding the Soviet entry into the war against Japan. Truman listened to each briefing with growing disbelief. He asked questions constantly, sometimes interrupting, sometimes pushing for clarification. The advisors around him tried their best to explain the months of planning that Roosevelt had carried out behind closed doors. Truman realized that Roosevelt had never intended for him to be deeply involved. Whether it was because he doubted Truman's experience or because he simply preferred to manage secrets within his inner circle, the result was the same. Truman was inheriting a global conflict with no roadmap. Despite the shock, Truman learned fast. He had always been a quick study, and he was used to making tough decisions back in Missouri. But this was a different world. Every decision now carried global consequences. Every choice affected millions of lives. As he moved through the days following Roosevelt's passing, Truman began reshaping the administration to reflect a leadership style that was completely different from Roosevelt's. He wasn't secretive. He wasn't a strategist who played people against each other. Truman believed in clarity, in directness, and in open communication. But part of him couldn't escape the feeling that Roosevelt had never viewed him as an essential partner. There was no briefing book left behind, no carefully prepared notes, no transition plan, nothing. Roosevelt's death left a vacuum so large that Truman had to reconstruct the entire wartime decision-making structure almost from scratch. One of the first major revelations came during his early discussions about the atomic project. Stimson and General Leslie Groves gave him a detailed explanation of what the program had achieved and what decisions would soon have to be made. Truman listened in silence. When they finished, he leaned back in disbelief. This was the biggest military scientific development in human history, and he had not even been aware of its existence. That moment made the truth undeniable. Roosevelt had not trusted him enough to bring him into the circle, but the situation went beyond information. Roosevelt's inner circle had created a culture of exclusivity. Advisors like Jimmy Burns openly viewed Truman as inexperienced. Eleanor Roosevelt believed that Truman lacked Roosevelt's global vision. Hopkins respected Truman, but never saw him as someone who needed to be briefed. All of them had contributed to the wall that Truman was now struggling to climb over. Even foreign leaders sensed the divide. When Winston Churchill met Truman for the first time, he immediately noticed that the new president had not been told the details of the Yalta agreements. Churchill himself had been in the room during those discussions. Now Truman was learning about them secondhand, without the context Roosevelt had carried in his own mind. Churchill later wrote that Truman seemed determined but uneasy, a man who knew he was being handed decisions made by someone else. Truman's adjustment to power was quick but not easy. He had to rely heavily on advisors who had been loyal to Roosevelt, even though many of them had contributed to keeping him uninformed. At the same time, he had to assert himself as the leader of the free world during one of history's most turbulent months. Germany was collapsing, the Pacific War was still raging, and the emerging tensions with the Soviet Union were beginning to shape what would become the early Cold War. What makes Truman's story so compelling is not just that he was uninformed, it's how rapidly he transformed himself into a decisive leader. Within weeks, he made bold decisions that Roosevelt had delayed or avoided. He took a tougher stance towards Stalin, pushing back against Soviet influence in Eastern Europe. He began preparing for a post-war world where America would take a more assertive role. He oversaw the final push in the Pacific and approved strategies that would bring the conflict to its end. Behind the scenes, Truman was still wrestling with the feeling of having been underestimated. He later admitted that he had been a spare tire on the back of the car. The job of vice president had not prepared him for anything he had to face. Roosevelt's secrecy had been so deep that Truman often wondered whether Roosevelt had left him a world shaped by intentional ambiguity. As the weeks went by, Truman created a new leadership culture in the White House. He demanded daily briefings. He insisted on being informed about all diplomatic communications. He reorganized committees, set up clearer chains of command, and made sure that information flowed directly to him. He had learned the hard way what it felt like to be kept out, and he was determined never to let the same thing happen to anyone who depended on him. In the end, the story of Truman and Roosevelt is not one of open feuding. It's a story of two very different men, two different leadership styles, and the reality of political power. In a world at war, Roosevelt trusted only a small circle and kept everyone else, including Truman, at a distance. Truman believed in transparency and felt the weight of having been left unprepared. The moment he inherited the presidency, he realized not only the size of the responsibility, but also the depth of the divide. He stepped into the role carrying the shock of being kept in the dark, but he quickly proved that he could guide the nation through victory and into a new era. The day Truman realized Roosevelt never trusted him was the same day he realized he had no choice but to rise to the challenge, and he did.